When a routine traffic stop becomes a pivotal moment, a police officer's darkest instincts clash with an unexpected truth he never anticipated. His subject is the very man who unknowingly holds the key to his future. Thank you for being with us. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out on the next meaningful stories. We have another impactful story coming your way tomorrow. The sun had begun its descent over Sacramento's streets, streaking the sky with gold and amber hues. Eric Porter was driving home after a tiring day at work, his sedan gently humming as he adjusted the cooling system. He was eager to let go of the tension from the day as the radio murmured softly, offering a quiet escape from the noisy city. He neared a yellow light, slowing as it changed to red, when suddenly red and blue lights flashed behind him and a siren screamed. Eric's eyes flicked to his rearview mirror, brows knitting slightly, as he eased to the curb and lowered his window. A police car stopped behind him, and out came Officer Bradley Larson, mid-30s buzz cut, badge gleaming. Larson adjusted his belt and strode toward the vehicle, walking with the easy authority of a man used to command. "License and registration," Larson said shortly, his tone flat but carrying unmistakable command. Eric obliged silently, retrieving his registration from the glove box and handing over his license. Though composed and precise, Eric could sense Larson's eyes raking over him, hunting for a pretext. "Do you know why I stopped you?" Larson asked, leaning slightly closer to the window. "I'm not completely sure," Eric answered steadily, his voice calm but firm. "You didn't come to a complete stop at the signal," Larson stated, though his tone briefly wavered. Eric gave a small nod, frowning slightly. "I see. I believed I had slowed enough, but I understand." Larson stayed silent, narrowing his eyes while examining Eric more intently. This was no longer just a basic stop. His stance subtly changed, signaling he'd decided there was more going on than a traffic mistake. He glanced at the license in his hand. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked. Eric paused briefly before replying. "I relocated here recently. The address is on the license." But Larson wasn't paying full attention, and his questions began to carry a new, sharper tone. Eric's steady presence seemed to unsettle him, and he leaned closer once again. "Where were you headed in such a rush?" "Just going home," Eric said evenly, but the thickening tension in the air was impossible to miss. Larson now saw Eric as more than just a driver. There was a suspicion taking hold. Eric sensed the shift but stayed composed. His quiet exterior was not innocence, but restraint. This was only the beginning. Larson stepped back, slowly folding the documents before slipping them into his chest pocket. He stood straight, expression turning faintly smug, as though judgment had already been passed. "Step out of the vehicle for me," Larson instructed. Eric's fingers briefly tightened around the wheel, but his face remained unreadable. "Is there a reason for that request, officer?" he asked calmly. Larson's mouth twitched, but he kept his face neutral. "I told you to step out. Don't make this harder." The unspoken threat hung heavily in the charged air. Eric exhaled and opened his door, stepping out as Larson's eyes swept over him. Eric stood slightly taller, his broad shoulders calm rather than intimidating. The tailored suit he wore signaled professionalism, and his polished shoes spoke to a meticulous nature. But none of that seemed relevant to Larson now. Larson motioned toward the front of the vehicle. "Hands where I can see them." Eric moved with deliberate care, placing his hands visibly and calmly. "Is there a specific concern you have, Officer Larson?" Larson smirked slightly. "Just routine. There's been trouble in this area. One can't be too cautious." Eric tilted his head, meeting Larson's eyes. "Trouble involving suited men in sedans? Or is there something else behind this?" The question hit hard, and Larson's facade slipped for just a moment. He straightened, hand drifting toward his belt, more instinct than action. "Watch your tone," he warned, voice tightening. "I'm simply clarifying the reason for this stop," Eric replied, voice steady but assertive. Larson scoffed but didn't answer, stepping back to pace a small circle before the car. Something in the interaction was shifting, slipping out of his control. Eric's lack of fear, his steady gaze, it threw Larson off balance. He wasn't reacting like most. No fear, no anxiety, no trembling hands. Instead, there was calm, a stillness that made Larson uneasy. "You're very sure of yourself," Larson murmured, mostly to himself. "Like you know how this will go." Eric didn't take the bait. He only tilted his head slightly. "It's not about confidence, officer. It's about respect." Larson paused briefly, then turned toward him again, his smugness replaced with something defensive. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Eric's cool restraint had disoriented him, and Larson didn't like that feeling. As silence grew, the air between them sparked with unspoken conflict. Larson realized this wouldn't unfold like he had predicted. But instead of retreating, he pushed forward harder, determined to regain control. His fingers tapped against the holster at his side, agitation seeping through. He wasn't accustomed to being questioned, especially not by someone like Eric. His eyes flicked to the car again, as if still hoping to find a reason. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood," he snapped. "I'm going to check you for weapons." Eric's brows rose. "Weapons?" he echoed, skeptical but calm. "Do I strike you as someone who carries a weapon?" Larson's jaw clenched, his mask slipping. "I won't repeat myself." Eric paused, something unreadable flashing in his eyes, then slowly turned and placed his hands on the hood. Larson came forward, the crunch of his boots breaking the silence. His pat-down was brisk, bordering aggressive, more about power than procedure. He let his hands linger too long, trying to provoke. But Eric stayed still, unbothered, unmoved beneath the invasive contact. "You're clean," Larson finally muttered, sounding annoyed. It was as if he resented not finding something that could justify his suspicion. Eric turned slowly, calm-faced but sharp-eyed. "Of course," he said simply. "Now, officer, if we're done here—" "I'm not finished," Larson cut in, his voice rising slightly, the words spilling out too fast, revealing his need to stay dominant. "You seem pretty familiar with what I can and can't do. Mind telling me why?" Eric crossed his arms, his stance loose despite the crackling tension between them. "I've had quite a few run-ins with police," he said. "Let's just say I've picked up a thing or two over the years." Larson's eyes narrowed. "That right? You some kind of lawyer?" Eric gave a faint smile. "Something like that." His vague reply seemed to needle Larson further, who moved in, stepping into Eric's space, his voice dropping low. "Listen, think you're smarter than me? Think words are going to save you now?" Eric locked eyes with him, unblinking. "I'm not assuming anything, officer. I just believe in justice, and I haven't seen much of that here." The sentence lingered in the air like a provocation, and Larson couldn't resist rising to it. "Justice? You think this is about justice?" he scoffed. "Guys like you always." He abruptly stopped. Though he hadn't finished the sentence, the implication clung like smoke. Eric's face remained neutral, but his posture shifted subtly, clearly signaling he'd caught the implication. "Guys like me?" Eric echoed, his voice soft but charged with intensity. Larson stiffened, taking a step back as if he'd realized he'd just crossed a point of no return. "You know what I meant," he mumbled, though the firmness in his voice had faded. "I believe I do," Eric answered quietly. Now, his calm was no longer passive. It was a scalpel slicing through Larson's thin facade. "And I think we both understand this stopped being about a stoplight long ago." Larson opened his mouth to reply, but no words came out. For the first time, he looked unsure. The control in the exchange was shifting, and Larson found himself on unstable footing. But the reckoning hadn't arrived yet, and when it did, it would stay with him forever. Eric's voice finally pierced the thick silence, steady and commanding. "Officer, it's time you learned who I am." Larson's eyebrows drew together, his irritation returning. "I don't care who you are," he snapped, but his tone betrayed the small crack forming in his confidence. Eric moved a hand to his pocket, deliberately and slowly. "I'm reaching for my credentials," he said, watching Larson's hand twitch near his sidearm. "No drama necessary. I want you to see for yourself." The air tightened, the silence loaded with something unsaid. Larson's gaze followed Eric's hand as he drew out a leather holder and opened it. Inside was a shining badge. Eric Porter, he said evenly, like he was introducing himself at a neighborhood barbecue. Head of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division. Larson froze, his eyes bouncing from the badge to Eric's face, trying to detect any trace of a lie. But there was no joking in Eric's look, only firm authority and clear disappointment. Internal Affairs, Larson repeated, his voice faltering. Yes, Eric cut in, sparing him the need to finish the thought. I monitor officer behavior. My job is making sure this badge stands for something more than just metal and stitching. Larson's face drained of color as the swagger drained from him like air from a punctured tire. He stumbled back slightly, hand dropping away from his belt like the badge's weight had suddenly doubled. Eric stepped closer, reclaiming the distance Larson had tried to create. Do you want to know the most concerning part of this encounter, Officer Larson? He asked, voice smooth but cutting. Larson stayed silent, looking like a man who realized too late that the floor beneath him was quicksand. It's not the profiling, Eric continued, though that's bad enough. It's not even the unwarranted escalation. It's that you've done all of this without knowing who you were dealing with. You assumed I didn't know my rights, that I wouldn't understand the rules you're expected to uphold. And why? Eric pressed, his eyes fixed like a spotlight. Larson opened his mouth, but nothing emerged. Because I didn't match the image of someone who deserves dignity? Eric concluded. His tone wasn't angry, but it struck like a gavel. And that's not just my issue. Officer, that's something every citizen you deal with will suffer for. Larson's shoulders slumped under the weight of the truth laid bare. He glanced again at the badge in Eric's hand, as if hoping it might vanish if ignored. Eric took a step back, giving Larson a moment to catch his breath, though his tone remained sharp. Here's what happens next, he said clearly. You're going to back up, give me back my documents, and be very mindful of your next words. Larson's lips parted, his body caught between resisting and yielding. But that moment of pause sealed his fate. Eric leaned in just a touch. And you'll be hearing from me again. Not as the guy you pulled over, he said, his voice dropping, but as the person who decides whether or not you're still fit to wear that badge. Larson swallowed, his face flushing as the weight of that reality landed hard. He reached into his pocket, pulling out Eric's license and registration, his fingers slightly shaking. Eric accepted them silently, slipping them into his wallet. He walked to the driver's side of his car, stopping with his hand on the handle. Turning back one last time, he caught Larson's eye. Remember this, Officer Larson, Eric said. The badge doesn't put you above anyone. It makes you answerable to everyone. Eric slid into the car, started the engine, and pulled away, leaving Larson in the dimming light. Larson stood there, confidence rattled, future unclear. But for Eric, this wasn't the end, just the start of something larger. The drive home passed in silence, but Eric's thoughts ran loud. The moment replayed in his mind, not because it was rare, but because it wasn't. Larson wasn't the first, and Eric knew he wouldn't be the last. But this time was different. This time Eric had the authority to respond. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the blinds in Eric's office at the Sacramento Internal Affairs Division. On his desk sat an open file, Officer Bradley Larson. It wasn't spotless. Minor complaints, dubious stops, vague behavior left unresolved. Eric leaned back, steepling his fingers as he pondered the broader issue at hand. Larson wasn't an outlier. He was evidence of something more systemic. And Eric wasn't going to settle for a temporary fix. A knock at the door broke his focus. His assistant Linda stepped in, holding a stack of paperwork. Good morning, Mr. Porter. Here's last month's misconduct summary. Also, Chief Daniels wanted me to remind you about next week's department review. Eric nodded, taking the reports from her hands. Thanks, Linda. Can you also arrange a meeting with the chief this afternoon? There was something in his voice that made her pause. Of course, she replied before quietly leaving the room. Eric redirected his focus to Larson's file, though his concern wasn't limited to just the officer in question. This situation represented more than a single event. It highlighted a mindset that justified behavior like Larson's. And if Eric had learned anything, it was that such a mindset always began at the top. That afternoon, Eric sat across from Chief Daniels in a meeting room. Daniels, a battle-tested leader with graying hair and a direct presence, reclined slightly as he listened to Eric recount the traffic stop. "I could have dismissed it as just another unfortunate encounter," Eric said, his voice calm but unwavering. "But that would have been a wrong call. Larson's actions aren't a fluke. They show how far we still have to go." Daniels ran a hand across his forehead, sighing deeply. "This isn't the first time I've heard about Larson," he confessed, "but we've always handled it discreetly in-house." "And that's exactly the issue," Eric replied. "Keeping things quiet doesn't solve the problem. Silence allows it to continue. We need to make noise now." Daniels looked at him, concern carved into his features. "What are you suggesting?" "A full department audit," Eric stated firmly. "Not just officers, but how we train, how we enforce policy, and how we hold ourselves accountable. We can't hide from this anymore. If we don't raise the bar, how can the public ever believe in us?" Daniels leaned in, placing his hands together on the table. "You're going to stir up a lot of resistance." "Good," Eric replied simply. "It's long overdue." In the following weeks, a surge of meetings, evaluations, and data reviews consumed Eric's schedule. He threw himself into the work, gathering statistics, interviewing staff, and organizing forums to hear from the community firsthand. The incident with Larson became a spark, igniting transformation and forcing the department to face its shortcomings directly. As for Larson, he stood before an internal disciplinary panel. Eric didn't hide his role. He sat across from Larson, watching as the officer wilted under the examination. The proceedings ended in a suspension, but Eric understood the true win wasn't in punishing Larson. It was in making sure the next Larson never got that far. Months later, Eric stood at a lectern at a civic gathering, speaking to a crowd of officers, leaders, and local citizens. His speech didn't dwell on fault. It centered on duty, a shared obligation to build a justice system that served every person it touched. His message wasn't merely about responsibility. It was a vow to improve. "Justice isn't only about catching criminals," Eric declared, his voice echoing through the room. "It's about ensuring those entrusted with authority act with honor, equality, and humanity. That's the badge I believe in, and it's the badge we're reshaping together." The applause erupted, but Eric didn't bask in it. To him, this wasn't a conclusion. It marked the start of a better path forward. As he stepped down from the platform, he scanned the audience, some faces doubtful, others encouraged but all attentive. He understood that change wouldn't arrive instantly, but it would arrive. And for now, that belief was enough. The story of Eric Porter is not just a tense interaction between a driver and a police officer during a routine traffic stop. It's a profound narrative that reflects the darker layers of law enforcement culture, where bias can overshadow reason and where authority can be easily abused if left unchecked. What captivated me most about this story was Eric's composure, courage, and sense of responsibility. He not only maintained his dignity in the face of prejudice, but also used his position to spark meaningful change in the system. From the very beginning, it's clear that Officer Larson's treatment of Eric goes beyond a standard traffic infraction. The suspicion, the loaded questions, and the escalating aggression all point to the fact that Larson was not simply doing his duty. He was acting on personal assumptions. But instead of reacting with anger or defiance, Eric responded with calm and reason, pushing back with logic, not hostility. This wasn't just intelligence. It was the discipline of someone who knew the law and understood how to confront injustice with strategy. The moment Eric revealed his true identity, the head of internal affairs for the Sacramento Police Department, was not just the climax of the story, but a turning point for Larson himself. Suddenly, the power dynamic shifted. The one enforcing authority became the one being evaluated. That reversal symbolized something greater. That power doesn't exempt anyone from accountability, and justice is not found in a badge, but in conduct and integrity. What I admire most about Eric isn't that he exposed Larson's misconduct, but that he saw the bigger picture. Larson was a symptom, not the disease. Eric chose not to close the file and move on. Instead, he demanded systemic reform. The internal review, the community forums, the push for better training and accountability standards. These actions proved Eric's commitment wasn't about revenge. It was about prevention. The biggest lesson I take from this story is that justice is not self-sustaining. It requires people brave enough to speak up, wise enough to act fairly, and patient enough to drive long-term change. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it begins with consistent actions from people like Eric, those who don't wield power to dominate, but to uphold principles. In a world where public trust in law enforcement is fragile, this story serves as a powerful reminder. Transparency, accountability, and respect for human dignity are what rebuild that trust. And sometimes, a simple traffic stop can become the starting point of a movement toward true justice. If this story struck a chord, consider sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. Let's ignite the dialogues that drive change. Subscribe to our channel for more true stories. Stories that move us, challenge us, and show what's possible when we stand for justice.